So the question is, when we treat sick fish with the common meds available, how much of it is really just guesswork? How much harm can we be doing by shotgunning antibiotics and antifungals, dewormers, etc., etc.?
Oh, this is a good question. I love this question. And I know Jen will have something to say about this too. So I think it's one of the hardest things about being a hobbyist, and I've found myself in this situation, like, if I don't have access to a microscope, or I don't have access to, like, MS-222 to sedate fish, you kind of are in there looking at them and you're like, well, what do I think is wrong, right? And if you don't have the tools to properly, get the correct diagnosis, probably most of the time, like when we're looking in our fish tanks and thinking about what's going on, we're making an educated guess. And, sometimes it's a better guess than other times. Obviously, I think the more experience you have, the better of an idea you're going to have of something. But I mean, I'll also say, like, even like people who are really, really good, like I'll look at something that I'm like, oh, this has to be it. And then I go and put it under a microscope and it's like, nope, totally wrong. So I think that's a great question, because I think a lot of the times, when fish are sick, you're making your best guess as to what's going on. And then, the second part of the question about then kind of coming up with an approach of, okay, this is what I think is wrong. How am I going to treat this? I think it raises a great point that I think it's really hard on fish. Like sometimes, like I'll like troll through and kind of look at, like fish disease forums or things like that, just to see what people are up to. And it can be like amazing what fish have been treated with, like prior to, someone like posting something on a forum, or even like I've had people call me about stuff, like they have a goldfish or, something else that they've done like 100 treatments on, before I've seen it. And I think it's pretty stressful on the fish. And I also think it can be hard to like assess like whether something worked if you're treating it with like 500 different things. So I think that one of the most important things when, if you have sick fish, is sometimes to take like a more general approach, and instead of getting like super targeted in on thinking like, oh my gosh, this is the exact parasite that this thing has to be, is to like look at a bigger picture of like making sure that your water quality is perfect. And then like trying like more like low stakes, low risk things like salts and things like that, and then kind of like ramping up from there. Because putting a bunch of drugs in, I really don't think it always helps. But Jen, I'm sure you probably have something to comment on about this.
Yeah, well, I mean, it kind of almost really goes back to the core of like why we're doing what we're doing with our website as well. I think that people can get too focused in on even, arguing. If you do go in and look at some of the groups about, oh, it's this, no, it's that, you should do that. Like, and the idea that you're going to get to a correct diagnosis that you can never confirm, as Nora said, if anybody should be able to look at a fish and guess what it has and get it right, it should be a fish vet. And she's just said, you can't do that, right? Because it's just, the time spent on, trying to argue between like if it's this or it's that, I think ultimately doesn't do you a lot of good. And we're trying to sort of help people learn a way to think about and to approach the problems rather than be, really prescriptive with what to do. I mean, certainly in some circumstances, there are things you can advise, directly on how to dose salt and things like that. But yeah, one of the harms that can come from, just adding all that stuff in, aside from the stress on the fish and the pieces that Nora mentioned, is you could be putting effort into dosing those medications and be missing, what's actually going on, or missing the effort to address the root cause. And so, when I worked at the Vancouver Aquarium, we had, massive water system. And I wrote about this, on our site about like the difference. There's an article there about the difference between like working in a public aquarium and at home, and which things are kind of better, which things are worse. And, dealing with a huge shared water system, we would do tank checks every single day in the morning. And you've got to catch problems early. So I think this is one of the things, like I even recommend, to home aquarists, like do, a tank check similar to how, you do in the public aquarium. Like you go in, you look, you're checking all the fish you want to see. Like, is there any, spots on the fins? How's the behavior? Is there one fish that's hanging? You're going to see problems and be able to address them before you're at the point where you've got a huge outbreak of something or an extremely sick fish. So that's really the key part, because that buys you time to think about, well, what's off in the environment that led to this? Is it social stress? Is it overpopulated? Am I behind on my water changes? Is my water quality not the right match for this fish? So yeah, really going back to the root causes is so important. And not, I guess, focusing on what is the exact cause of this, thinking that you can figure it out, and looking for, I guess, more, broad spectrum things. And that's where, like, we're extreme fans of using salt and dosing it properly, because that's something, that Nora has said, and like with the references we've looked at and my personal experience, can deal with a lot of different problems pretty effectively. So yeah, it's tough. It's tough though when you don't have a microscope and you don't have, the ability to do diagnosis. And here in Canada, it's been like these sort of alternative methods, or more like holistic methods, have more or less been forced on us as Canadian aquarists, because in 2019, I believe it's Health Canada, they basically took like all those fish meds that, you guys can get in the US, or I don't know what you've got, overseas, but off the shelves. They said, sorry, we're not going to sell, bottled antibiotics and, all these things anymore. So you're basically stuck with like Melifix and salt, and maybe you can get a bit of copper if you're lucky. So you've got to be a lot more clever about keeping your fish healthy now.
Yeah, we here in New Zealand are in a pretty similar situation. I don't think it's quite as extreme as in Canada, but we don't have basically anything either. So I know where you're coming from.
So here's a kind of fun one, because I always get a kick out of this. When you go to the pet store and you look here in the US, one of the, and I don't even remember what they call it, but one of the products that's available is it's erythromycin, which is an antibiotic, and it's for gram-positive bacterial infections. Well, the hilarious part is probably 90+% of the time when an aquarium fish has a bacterial infection, it's gram negative. So erythromycin isn't even going to work on that. And I always feel really bad for people, because, you'll see that they've gone and bought it, they're dosing their fish with it, but it's probably not doing anything. And so it's they've wasted their money. They aren't doing what they need to be doing to help their fish, right? Because they think that they're doing it. And it's just, it's really unfortunate. So it's also funny, because even here in the US, where we still have some of the stuff, they don't even have the right drugs available to help people.
We've had another 2 questions that are almost very similar. So I'll ask one and then follow directly up with the next one. Which of those alternative medicines are not even worth trying, or does it depend on the symptoms? Which is then followed up by Zen Ginger asking, how do you feel about products like Pimifix and Melifix?
So I think I'll start with the Pimifix Melifix thing and then move to the second question. I really don't think that those work. I think one of the hardest things with I guess as a licensed veterinarian, I'm very spoiled, because I can write a prescription for anything I want to write a prescription for, and I have access to FDA approved drugs, or drugs that are manufactured in a way that what's in them, how much is in them, stuff like that. The really hard thing about any medications that you're getting from the fish store or on the internet is even worse. You just don't know what's in them. You just can't be 100% sure. And so even if theoretically the ingredient in the medication is correct, it's hard to know, is it at the correct concentration, etc. And so that's a pretty big challenge. But I will say, I don't think Pimifix or Melifix really have anything in them that is proven to have efficacy against common pathogens, in the aquarium trade. Now, someone can feel free to prove me wrong, but I just don't think that they work. But moving past that to sort of the next question, which is sort of how to approach, you have sick fish in your tank, and how to approach treating them. I've been thinking about this a lot, because, one of the hard things is unless I look at the fish myself and examine them, it's really challenging. You just can never do a good job for someone and help them, get the right answer. but I do think that there's sort of this, and I have to credit Jen, because I think she's gotten me thinking on this track, that there is sort of like a general approach to like a common presentation. And so like one thing that we talked a little bit about is like white spots on fish. So if your fish have white spots on them, what is the most likely thing going on? Well, it's probably an ectoparasite of some kind. Could also be like a water mold, like saprolegnia. Maybe it's a bacterial infection, but like we're probably sitting, you know, somewhere there. And so then thinking about like of the most common causes of that, you know, how do we treat that? And that's where I know that we keep talking about salt, but that's kind of what got our salt article going, is that like if you're looking at your fish and it's got white stuff on it, that is a great place to start. And then kind of like see what happens from there. And I've been thinking about that to try to like spur like a couple other articles. You know, other things people talk a lot about are like, you know, columnaris. People get really excited about columnaris. And also like, you know, fin rot is something, which what is fin rot? But you know, those kinds of things. But I think a really important thing is to like end up with like a general category, and then kind of identify like the most likely cause of that, and then try to come up with a treatment for that. I think that kind of answered that second question. I don't know if you want to chime in, Jen.
Yeah, definitely thinking about this sort of category of what you're dealing with and what's available to you to deal with it, and why you might have gotten in that situation. Because, you know, I can tell you just from, you know, years of experience at the aquarium, fish don't really get sick randomly a lot of the time. Like we were saying earlier, you know, they're pretty hardy creatures ultimately. But of course, yeah, something I always thought about working at the aquarium is I compared it to being a Piscine nurse, because literally everything is on life support at all times. So it is, you know, it's just so much easier than with any other type of animal to have an environmental issue coming up, right? Yeah. I mean, you're managing the water in which, you know, they're swimming and where they're getting oxygen from. Like, you know, really it's this whole system. So you've got to look at that. And as soon as we've got, you know, fish that are all, you know, crowded together, it absolutely adds stress. You know, talking to someone, you know, online recently, they had a fish with white spots. The fish, you know, wasn't healing up well. We're kind of going through like some ideas on that. And the conversation that never happened until I sort of asked the question, I was like, well, where is this fish on the social hierarchy? Is this fish being beat up? Is it having some chronic stress of some kind? Why is this the only one in your tank that's got these white spots? And the answer was, oh yes, this guy gets picked on all the time. And so, yeah, I mean, chronic stress right there, you know, and that's what led to that, even though the other fish actually stayed healthy in this person's aquarium. And so, you know, we actually talked about, okay, well, you know, once you get through this, what can you do to reduce that? Can you add some hiding spots? Can you even just cut up some PVC pipes so there's somewhere, you know, for this fish to hide? And be aware that, you know, if this fish dies, there's probably going to be another fish that's then going to be at the bottom of the pecking order, at least when it comes to cichlids, you know, particularly. But really thinking about, you know, the behavioral aspect, the husbandry aspects, the environmental parameters. And that's the interplay, you know, that we always had, you know, at the aquarium between our veterinary department and the aquarist. It is that art and science, right? And that blend. And that's what I really love about working with Nora, is that we both, you know, bring like each side of that to our conversations and to our suggestions and to how we're thinking about problems and how to help people.